6 weeks later, that same sergeant stood at attention outside my office, his hands shaking so hard the paper in them wouldn't stay still. He couldn't look me in the eye. But I want you to remember him the way he was that day in the store. Loud, laughing, so sure of himself. Because in about 90 seconds, all of that confidence was going to disappear. And it started with 4 words he never should have said. Let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon. My name is Major Kate Ellery, United States Air Force. I'd just landed back home after 11 months overseas, and all I wanted was toothpaste and a candy bar. I hadn't even changed out of my service dress uniform. I'd come straight from the terminal to the base exchange, ribbons and all, still half asleep from the flight. The line at the register was long. Ahead of me stood a sergeant, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who fills a room with his voice whether you want him to or not. He was talking to a young airman next to him, some junior enlisted kid who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I didn't think anything of it. I was just tired, waiting for my turn, staring at the gum rack. Then the sergeant turned around. He looked me up and down, the ribbons on my chest, rows of them, some earned in places I still don't talk about, and he smiled like he'd found something funny. "Halloween's over," he said, loud enough for the whole line to hear. "Ditch the fake medals." The whole PX line turned to look. A few people chuckled, unsure if it was a joke or not. The sergeant laughed the loudest, proud of himself, glancing around to see who was watching. I didn't say anything. I just reached for my wallet, the way you do when you're too tired to fight a stranger's ego in a checkout line. But the young airman next to him, the one who'd looked so uncomfortable a minute earlier, went pale. He knew something the sergeant didn't. I could see it in his face. He opened his mouth like he wanted to warn a sergeant, then closed it again. He was afraid. That told me everything I needed to know about how this sergeant treated the people under him. This wasn't the first time he'd humiliated someone in public. It was just the first time he'd picked the wrong person. As I opened my wallet to pay, something fell into my palm instead of my card. A coin. Heavy, silver, engraved with a wing commander's insignia, a coin given to me personally, 2 years earlier, by a 2-star general, for actions during a rescue mission I still don't discuss in detail. It wasn't decoration. It was proof of exactly who I was and what I'd done to earn it. I didn't plan to show it to anyone. It just landed in my hand, but the sergeant saw it. His laugh died in his throat, mid-breath, like someone had reached in and switched it off. He knew exactly what that coin meant. Every service member does. You don't get one from a general for showing up on time. You get one for something that changes the way people look at you for the rest of your career. His eyes moved from the coin, to my ribbons, to my name tape above my pocket. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. He hadn't just mocked a stranger in a PX line. He'd mocked a decorated field officer, in front of his own troops, in front of half the base, and one of those troops already knew who I was. That airman standing next to him wasn't just nervous. He'd served under my command 8 months earlier during a joint operation overseas. He recognized me the second I turned around. He just hadn't been given the chance to say so before his sergeant opened his mouth. The sergeant's hands started shaking. Not from fear of a stranger, from the sudden, sick realization that this was going to follow him. In our world, moments like this don't stay quiet. Someone always talks. I put the coin back in my wallet, paid for my toothpaste, and walked out without another word. I didn't need to say anything yet. I already knew where I'd be in 3 days, leading a scheduled review of exactly his unit.
I want to be clear about something.
This was never about embarrassing him back. Yelling in a parking lot wouldn't have taught him anything he needed to learn. What he needed was to understand, clearly and permanently, that respect isn't something you hand out based on how someone looks to you in a checkout line. 3 days later, I walked into his squadron for a leadership assessment I'd already been assigned weeks earlier, before any of us knew our paths were about to cross. I didn't request it. I didn't manipulate it. It was simply the job I'd been sent home to do. Review command climate across 3 squadrons, based on complaints that had been quietly piling up on a colonel's desk for months. His squadron was one of them. When I walked into that briefing room in full uniform, silver oak leaves on my collar, his face went white all over again. This time there was no PX crowd to hide behind. Just me, him, and the young airman who'd tried to warn him, sitting third row, saying nothing, because he'd already told the truth once and hadn't been listened to. The review took 2 days. I didn't bring up the PX incident once. I didn't need to. What I found instead was worse for him than anything I could have said personally. Airmen described a pattern. Junior troops mocked in front of their peers. Mistakes punished with public humiliation instead of correction. A command climate built on fear instead of respect. And at the center of nearly every account was the same sergeant who'd laughed at a stranger's uniform without bothering to check who she was first. The young airman from the PX finally spoke, in a private interview, without his sergeant in the room. He described what he'd wanted to say that day but couldn't, that the woman his sergeant had just insulted outpranked him by 2 full grades, that she'd led the very rescue operation his unit studied in training, and that he'd been too afraid of retaliation to correct his sergeant in front of a crowd. That fear was the real finding of my report. Not one embarrassing moment in a store. A culture where junior troops were too scared to speak the truth, even when their sergeant was about to walk into it headfirst. The sergeant was called in front of the squadron commander. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, and I didn't ask to be. This was never about revenge for an insult. It was about a pattern that needed to be corrected before it caused real harm to someone's career, or worse, their confidence to ever speak up again. He received a formal reprimand for his broader conduct pattern, was moved out of a leadership role, and was required to complete extended training focused on respect and communication in the ranks. His career wasn't destroyed, but the easy path he'd been walking, mocking people for sport, assuming rank meant he could say anything to anyone, that path closed for good. 6 weeks after that day in the PX, he stood outside my office, waiting for a scheduled follow-up meeting required by his corrective plan. His hands were shaking. He apologized, quietly, without an audience this time, without anyone to perform for. I told him the truth. I wasn't angry about the ribbons. I was angry that a young airman had been too afraid to speak up for what he already knew was right. Here's what I've learned in over a decade of service. You never really know who's standing in front of you. The quiet person in line, the one you decide to make fun of for an easy laugh, they might be carrying more history, more sacrifice, and more strength than you'll ever see on the surface. Respect shouldn't depend on what you can prove to a stranger. It should be the starting point, every time, for everyone. That sergeant learned it the hard way. I hope you don't have to. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone, only to find out later just how wrong you were? And if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.